Everyone, Scott Sigrist. We've been discussing liberal theory with Hobbes and Locke. Now I want to focus on two real world um, forms of liberalism, models of liberalism, and that is the liberalism of the American founding and of the French founding, you could say, in the late 1700s and early 1800s. We'll start with the American founding. First of all, sort of a historical overview. And as I go through these elements of the American founding, I'm going to refer to the documents that you read in the packet. But you could say, really, that there were several American foundings. There were the early foundings in the North and in the South with the first settlements. In the North, which turned out to have longer term significance in terms of shaping American political outlook, I guess you could say. Um, and, uh, and in the North, it was primarily a religious founding, right? They were people seeking religious liberty in the form of religious self-government, not necessarily in the form of individual um, religious autonomy or something like that. Although that kind of gets going pretty quickly thereafter. But these were societies self-consciously founded on covenants. These Puritan communities, the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay colonies, they were Puritans, which comes out of a Calvinist background. Puritans, remember, had launched a civil war in England, and there was very much carryover from a lot of the ideas of the Puritans during that period in England. Um, and they saw themselves very much on the model of uh, the Old Testament Israel. Sometimes they call themselves a new Israel, these Puritans coming over. And there was their imaginations were shaped by biblical symbolism. So they were leaving the land of slavery, like the Israelites left Egypt. Um, they came over to a promised land, to the New World, and they even wrestled for a time in the wilderness, if you know the biblical story, fighting this wild, untamed country in the New World. All of them meant to be going to Virginia, by the way, but they got off course and landed in Massachusetts, which is a much less welcoming environment in the winter. Um, but in any case, you have societies founded on covenants, um, contracts, if you will, and this is a good 60, 70 years before Locke, um, before Locke, before Hobbes even um, developed the modern theory of social contract. Right, the covenant idea goes back deep into the Old Testament with the patriarchs, Abraham, and then especially Moses, who makes a communal covenant. And the Old Covenant idea was um, the people are all promising to each other and simultaneously to God that they will abide by the laws of the community. In the Old Testament case, of course, the laws of God given to Moses. Um, the covenant had a sort of horizontal and a vertical dimension. There was an agreement among all the people, but it was before God. It was a kind of sacred oath. Um, and that, very much these early religious settlers had that in mind. The Mayflower Compact, right? There it is, compact, explicitly refers to their making a covenant. the model of Christian charity. That was the Pilgrims, by the way, the Mayflower Compact. Then up in Massachusetts Bay, Governor Winthrop wrote this model of Christian charity, um, and he also calls it a covenant. And he echoes the covenant idea of the Old Testament near the end of that um, sermon or essay, whatever it is, um, where he says, uh, we've made this covenant, and if we keep to the covenant, God will bless us, and we will be an example, a model to the world. But if we break it, we will have failed mankind. We'll be a disgrace. Um, and this idea very much shaped the American psyche. I mean, this idea that America was something special, that it would be a model to the world, um, that uh, if it failed here, it might not succeed anywhere. Um, and this idea of an American experiment, um, John Adams called it an experiment in liberty. John Adams, of course, coming from Massachusetts himself, um, still feeling the effects of Puritan thought. So this is a case where religious influence. I'm sorry about this. I got marker on my hands, but this is a case where religious influence shaped even secular understanding. Right? The way Winthrop puts it is, we shall be like a city upon a hill, right? And you've had um, American presidents explicitly refer to this. President Reagan liked to use the phrase "a shining city upon a hill," um, and Lincoln, if you know the Gettysburg Address, he talks about the Civil War as a test of whether, excuse me, of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure on the earth. In other words, again, if it failed here, um, that might be it for the world. He called America the last best hope uh, for liberty, and he also called Americans, as Lincoln, um, the almost chosen people. There's a dose of humility there, but it's still a sense that America had a special place in history. Um, and then, but these communities, the Massachusetts Bay, I'll take that as an example. It was a closed community, right? It was democratically run in a sense because the elders ran the community, but they were elected by the community, Winthrop and all those guys. So it was a decentralized structure uh, of ecclesiastical order, and democratic in that sense. You had to, they had some pretty strict guidelines for how you had to live, and you had to live by them. You had to adhere to the theological doctrines of the regime, right? But there was this very much like Locke conceived of religious communities as voluntary associations in which you could, once you joined, you would have to follow the rules of the organization, but you could withdraw any time. And this happened in Massachusetts Bay. Um, there were two important um, characters that represent sort of the wave of the future for America. One of them is Roger Williams, who came to feel that this kind of rigid these kind of rigid rules for the community amounted to religious persecution. If people had different ideas, that wasn't acceptable. And Roger Williams left and formed the colony of Rhode Island, which was notable for its very extraordinary degree of religious liberty and you see in the bloody tenet of persecution, that's actually a table of contents that you're reading there, basically. It was from a larger book, but um, it's extraordinary religious freedom in there. The condemnation of persecution, the idea that Christianity is antithetical to persecution in its original spirit, um, uh, that even he goes so far as to even say even Muslims and non-Christian faiths should be free to practice their faith. Um, and so this was quite extraordinary. This is 1600s, right? And then the other character was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Uh, Anne Hutchinson. The story with her was she was um, um, giving Bible study lessons in her house, um, and she claimed that she started to have visions from God um, about uh, how they should live and so forth, and eventually this this kind of individualistic brand of faith um, was called into question by the elders of Massachusetts Bay, and they talked to Anne Hutchinson and suggested that this is not in line with our theological beliefs, and you need to kind of get in line. And Winthrop, the governor, came to her privately and suggested, hey, it might be a good idea if you kind of just got out of town. And so she self-exiled and went on somewhere else. But this kind of um, idea of faith as a matter of personal conscience and individual sort of personal standing before God and accountable only to God for their religious beliefs and so forth. This was the way of the future. That's in the North. In the South, there was a different motivation. People in the South, in the original Virginia settlements, and so on, were seeking economic opportunity. And related to this was slavery. Pretty quickly, pretty early on, so that you got in the South. In the North, you had a pretty um, democratic communities coming out of these early Puritan foundations. But in the South, you had a kind of partially democratic, partially oligarchic regime, aristocratic regime, with with a white upper class and a white lower class, and then of course the slave population. And Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to study the America in the 1830s, noted how different the North and the South were, um, and he thought the North was much healthier in many ways, and Tocqueville thought that the one thing that could break the United States and U.S. democracy was the institution of slavery. Or race relations in general. He talked about the Indian population too. By the way, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the best book ever written on America. I'm not the only one to say that. It's a must read. It's a long book, 2 volumes, 1,000 pages, but it is brilliant, deeply insightful. So anyway, so then moving forward, some religious background to the American Revolution is worth noting, and that is the Great Awakening in the 1740s and 50s, which really shook up the country, up and down the eastern seaboard. First time different colonists started thinking of people in the other colonies as sort of in a continuous community with them. A national consciousness begins to develop, and because everybody's paying attention to what's happening around the whole country as these revivals sweep up and down the eastern seaboard. It was very controversial. there were a lot of people for and a lot of people against, but a general national consciousness and the enthusiasm, the sort of emotional enthusiasm that this Great Awakening involved. Um, some scholars think was uh, important background to the American Revolution, the sacred cause of liberty, always with a sort of a religious aura to it, um, among many. Politics before the Revolution. Here's the political context. For close to 2 centuries, Americans had been governing themselves. Britain had a policy that was called salutary neglect, healthy neglect. Um, it was mutually beneficial to the British to kind of let the colonies do their own thing, govern themselves, you know, raise their own taxes, pass their own laws, etc. Um, so long as they complied with the tariffs and regulations relating to relation of the colonies to the outside world, everything was fine. And so there's this long tradition of self-government, including elected legislatures in the colonies, and that's what made what today would be relatively minor um, tax increases and such, they caused for resistance. The Stamp Act and all of the other um, acts that came along. Um, these were called innovations by the colonists. Specifically, they're for the first time ever interfering with our internal self-government um, and trying to tax us internally as opposed to just externally in relation to, say, trade and so forth with the outside world. Um, and during this revolutionary period, you had what is sometimes called pamphlet wars, hundreds of pamphlets appealing to political theory and religion um, to argue for how to respond to these British intrusions. And of course, you increasingly end up with with outright revolt and a revolution and independence. The Declaration of Independence, which declares this, of course, does something more. It also states a list of principles, which it didn't need to do technically to to establish independence, but it did. And I think with the Declaration, you could say there is a founding of a nation. For the first time, I mean, the colonies, they met in a continental congress, right? But it was not one nation. It was a bunch of, Congress comes from the term delegates, right? And there were delegates essentially from different political entities, right? Um, they weren't a nation, but with the Declaration of Independence, it says in the first paragraph, uh, when it becomes necessary for one people to establish themselves separate apart from the political bands that have connected them before, right? I'm paraphrasing. Um, this document, a unanimous statement of the United States of America, is the language. It founds a nation. This is one people. But in the same way as Locke's second treatise suggested, the founding of a people did not establish the government. There was an acting government in the Continental Congress, but there was not a settled government, right? That would come with constitutions. And then that leads to the last founding, if you will, the founding of the constitutional order, the establishment of the government, very much along Lockean lines of a trust, right? And of course, they didn't get it right the first time. Their first try was the Articles of Confederation, which was a confederacy in the sense that it was basically a league of friendship is the language in the Articles, between independent sovereign states. Um, they ended up scrapping that and forming a politically unified nation with the U.S. Constitution, and that is, of course, what we have still today. Key, the key explanation of the theory behind the Constitution is in the Federalist Papers, which Jefferson called um, I think he called it the greatest work of political theory ever written, which is pretty high praise, especially considering Jefferson was associated more with the Anti-Federalists. Although he never opposed, like many of the Anti-Federalists did, opposed the Constitution. Some of the big names, Patrick Henry, George Mason, they opposed the Constitution, thought it was centralizing power too much at the federal level, right? So the Anti-Federalist writings are important too, especially partly in fleshing out the theory of the founding, but also in bringing about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. It wasn't part of the original Constitution, right? It's the first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution in response to concerns of the Anti-Federalists, and that was very much supported by Jefferson. Madison didn't think Bill of Rights was necessary. It's a long story, but Jefferson said it's absolutely critical. And of course, the Bill of Rights wasn't added until after the ratification of the Constitution, but the ratification was premised on a promise by many of the representatives to try to get a Bill of Rights. And Madison, true to his word, put that together first thing in the first Congress after ratification. You got right in the beginning, there were debates about what the Constitution meant right from the beginning. We had these constitutional debates and question about how to read the Constitution, and you had that right from the beginning. And the two main characters here are Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton thought the Constitution constitutional language should be read broadly, and Jefferson thought it should be read very narrowly. Classic case here is the Bank of the U.S. Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, wanted to establish a Bank of the U.S. to establish some kind of monetary control and to make borrowing from other nations easier, and so forth. And there was a constitutional debate over this. Hamilton defended his position by saying that if the end of whatever it is that the government wants to do is not prohibited by the Constitution and it's consistent, and the end is provided for by the Constitution, then that implies that any means necessary to achieve that end, so long as it's not prohibited by the Constitution, doesn't violate individual rights, is constitutionally allowable. Whereas Jefferson thought not at all. He thought Bank of the U.S. was unconstitutional because there was no provision for such a thing in the Constitution. So Jefferson, pretty strict constructionist in that regard. And of course, this kind of argumentation about the constitutional order went on to today. Intellectual influences on the American founding. First of all, there's the Enlightenment. Everybody sort of knows that these days. And I would mention sort of three elements, three influences within the Enlightenment that are important. First, there's liberalism, especially in the form of Locke, but also Montesquieu is very important here. Locke was the modern philosopher most influential on the Declaration of Independence, and you can see both the conceptual framework and the language of the Declaration is very Lockean. If you don't see Locke all over the Declaration, you're either not reading the Declaration closely or you're not reading Locke closely. But the big influence on at the Constitutional Convention was not Locke, but Montesquieu. Montesquieu was the name brought up more than any other. Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws, and who endorsed a separation of powers that included an independent judiciary, um, and also that presented a kind of liberal politics that was sensitive to cultural um, realities and circumstances. One of the criticisms of Locke was that it was abstract, and the, the ideas were abstract, and he didn't account for how and to what extent his ideas could be applied in different national contexts. And Montesquieu was very sensitive to that. A good example of the influence of Montesquieu in terms of writings of the founding, you can see in John Adams' Thoughts on Government, uh, which has a whole lot. If you read Montesquieu, then you can see it immediately. A whole lot of influence um, on, on John Adams' formulations, including this what seems to us sort of strange discussion at the end about the importance of frugality, um, and the idea was that Republican uh, virtue is undermined by luxury. Um, Republicanism requires a kind of hearty self-reliance and sort of a hint of Spartan virtue. You know, the simple life and valuing freedom above luxury. Um, that's something Montesquieu talked a great deal about, in addition to things like checks and balances. Um, so that's the first influence of from the Enlightenment. The second one that I would mention are the modern natural law theorists, and you could include Locke as one of those, but these others aren't maybe liberal um, in the same sense. You had Grotius, who was almost preceded the Enlightenment, but on the cusp of it. Pufendorf, other names like Vattel and Burlamaqui that you haven't heard, but the founders read very closely. Blackstone, and you can see a bunch of these names in Alexander Hamilton's letter to the Farmer Refuted, which is a terrific summation of natural law theory um, guiding American ideas, understanding about politics. The third that I'll mention, um, Enlightenment influence was Scottish philosophy, and this has recently been recovered as a very important influence. Um, there was a Scot named Francis Hutcheson who had a theory very similar to Locke's in many ways, but stressing um, the importance of uh, duties as well as rights, stressing the social um, dimension of human society. Uh, that the Scots tended to be more communitarian uh, and different from Locke in that sense. If Locke is a quintessential individualist, they were more communitarian. And Hutcheson influence was a big influence on two names that you will recognize, David Hume and Adam Smith. And then a third that you don't probably won't recognize, but had a massive influence, was a guy named Thomas Reid, the father of um, so-called Scottish common sense philosophy. He was responding to a skepticism of Reid about our ability to know moral truth, and he sort of lays a foundation, empirical foundation, um, and a kind of neo-Aristotelian um, answer to Hume. um, And important example of the influence of this is me. I'll mention three things. One, the idea of self-evident truths that you see in the Declaration of Independence. This was very much part of the thing, the idea. Um, um, then Jefferson's letter to Peter Carr, which is in your readings, his discussion of the moral sense. That's the language of Francis Hutcheson, and he conceives it very much like Thomas Reed does. And then, what was the third that I wanted to mention? Um, oh well, the use of the term common sense was often brought up by intellectuals of the American founding. So Thomas Paine's Common Sense, for example, which was the pamphlet that sort of crystallized support for independence um, just before I guess it was 1776. Uh, already, it was already 1776, but that term, common sense, would have had a philosophical resonance for intellectuals at the time, beyond what everyone would have thought common sense as being sensible, um, you know, having good horse sense or whatever you want to call it. Um, and then the Scottish common sense, also called Scottish realism, became a dominant force in American universities for the next 100 years. A lot of this is forgotten, but this is very important at the time. And one of the important figures here in America, one of the forgotten founders, as they're sometimes called, was a guy named John Witherspoon, who was a Scottish immigrant. He came over to take the presidency of the College of New Jersey, which was later become Princeton, which became under Witherspoon's tenure known as the School of Statesmen because so many prominent statesmen came out of that school, including one James Madison. And James Madison's ideas, you can see them very much in Witherspoon's then unpublished but uh, later published lectures on moral philosophy. Moral philosophy was a capstone course in Princeton, and it was heavily influenced by Scottish uh, common sense philosophy. Um, and it became a template for universities all over the country because Witherspoon was the most one scholar called him probably the most influential academic in American history because his lectures on moral philosophy became the template for political philosophy and ethics in universities that were, of course, uh, sprouting up all over the country at this stage as the country grew. So um, those are Enlightenment influences, right? Um, Liberalism, the modern natural law theorist, and Scottish philosophy. And then there's also the classical tradition, um, which by which we mean ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, especially Aristotle and Cicero, um, and then Roman history, like Livy, Tacitus, Polybius, and others. Rome was a very important, on the historical side, Rome was a very important influence because uh, the founders were thinking about how to make a republic work. Historically, republics did not last long. And the Roman Republic lasted for 500 years. So they wanted to think about what they did right. And they also wanted to think about why it fell. And, um, you ended up with a kind of absolute monarchy with the Caesars. Um, uh, a couple of examples in your readings. James, John Adams' thoughts on government again, when he talks about happiness being the end of government, and he appeals to the notion that virtue is the foundation of happiness. This is obviously a reference, uh, a holdover from um, classical. I mean, he references even people outside of the Western tradition there in support of that position. But this is sort of straight out of Aristotle. Aristotle's influence is very apparent in that essay. And by the way, the thoughts on government was recommendations. It was meant to be recommendations for the different colonies as they were establishing themselves now as states under the United States and trying to set up their own constitutions. That was one of the things that Continental Congress um, urged people to do after independence was you states should start um, forming your own constitutions. And so he was given advice there, and he himself wrote the Constitution of Massachusetts, which is part of which is also in your reading. Um, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Um, then, if you look at Jefferson's 1825 letter to Henry Lee in your readings, uh, when Jefferson's talking about uh, what he was trying to do with the Declaration of Independence, um, that's a great story, by the way. Jefferson, this is 1825 on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is very old, obviously. Henry Lee of the famous Lee family in Virginia writes Jefferson to see if he's going to the great 50-year celebration. Number one, and number two is if you had a chance to sit down with Jefferson and ask him one question, this would be a good one. What was on your mind when you wrote the Declaration of Independence? And in this letter, he talks about American understanding of rights. And at the bottom, at the end of the portion of the letter that you have there, he mentions the sources of their understanding of rights. And among them are what he calls elementary books of public right, by which he means political theory. And he mentions, you'll notice, not only modern thinkers, but ancient thinkers. Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. is what he writes. Sidney was another modern thinker, very much in this writing in the same spirit as Locke, but unlike Locke, appealing directly to classic Greek philosophy as a foundation for what you could call something like liberal theory. And then Jefferson, in his letter to John Adams, that where they talk about natural aristocrats. This notion of a natural aristocracy is from Plato and Aristotle, right? That there are people with special natural capacities, and if they develop those capacities into virtues, then they're naturally the best to rule. And Jefferson says there, we don't want what people usually have and what they had in Britain and in Europe. We don't want an aristocracy of wealth and status, but we very much do want an aristocracy, a natural aristocracy. That is, the most talented and most virtuous people ought to be the ones we choose to rule us. So that's from the classical tradition as well. Okay, so you have Enlightenment, you have the classical tradition. A third major source is the English common law tradition. I mean, England had a long tradition of liberty stretching all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And moving forward to the English Bill of Rights in 1689 in the wake of the Glorious Revolution. And you can see this, the best example of this is in the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment through the Eighth Amendment are virtually, they're taken right out of the Magna Carta and the English tradition. Those are all common law rights that are mentioned there that they thought were especially valuable for protecting natural rights. By the way, you get a hint of the natural right rights background in the Ninth Amendment, where it says um, the enumeration of rights in this Constitution um, shall not be construed as uh, what's the what's the phrase? Um, not be construed as like essentially exhausting the rights that people have. So, in other words, there were rights that didn't beyond what were legally recognized by the government, and that points you to natural rights, and also uh, we call customary rights and so forth. We won't go into that, but so that's an English common law tradition, extremely important, especially behind the thinking of how to do the judicial system, right? Um, then there was Protestant Christianity, massively important. The Bible was the one book everybody read. Everybody read the Bible. And so the political literature is replete with biblical examples, biblical metaphors, and so forth. And you can see in the Declaration of Independence, it's not explicitly Christian, but it's clearly theistic. It's not deistic. I mean, deism. If deism means a clockmaker God, who made the world and then let it go and it's totally uninvolved, the Declaration of Independence is more than that. I mean, you have the divine lawmaker and the law of nature's God, um, and the Creator, giver of rights, um, and the supreme judge um, of the world, um, judging the conscience, but also the you could say the supreme executive of the world in providence, divine providence. There's an appeal to divine providence at the end of the Declaration of Independence. Very, very much remained an important influence on American politics, and you see the development of the thinking about religious liberty and Jefferson's bill for establishing religious liberty, and of course that provision against establishment of religion on the national level, at least at this point, in the First Amendment. You can see in terms of the influence of religion, as opposed to protection against protection of individual conscience and protection against religious tyranny in the form of establishment. You see the influence in a positive sense in John Adams' Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. They talk about the importance of religion as in the preamble of the document. Jefferson, when he's talking about slavery and divine judgment, right? How can our liberties be secure if we don't believe that they come from God, and God's justice can't sleep forever, and so forth. So Jefferson, who was certainly not an Orthodox Christian, still had this kind of idea, right? John Adams' statement to the Massachusetts militia that the Constitution established in 1791, when it was ratified, is made only for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate for any other. And the thinking behind that was that you can see it in George Washington's farewell address, where he mentions how essential good morals are for political prosperity, and the idea that good morals are for most people at least, are based on religion. And so the idea that religion was important, not it shouldn't be influential from the top down, like imposed by the government, but from the bottom up. It was the primary foundation for morality, and this was essential to self-government. the idea that no people could be expected to govern themselves well unless, uh, as a community, unless they govern themselves well as individuals. Um, and that was a matter of moral character, right? Um, and and religion was thought to be uh, play a hugely important role there. And religion also had a very important public um, role in speaking to politics. There was a literature which was very much alive um, during the Revolutionary period and beyond, well into the 1800s, called the political sermons. Um, and it, uh, colonies and later states asked some prominent clergymen to speak to what the Bible has to say about the need for virtue, or the right kind of liberty, or um, you know what a good leader uh, ought to do, and so on. And one of the most famous ones was from this guy Witherspoon that I mentioned, who was also a Presbyterian minister as well as president of Princeton. And he wrote this he gave this political sermon, his first public statement on politics, in 1776, called "The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men," which was basically a defense of the justice of the cause of the colonies and why war against Britain was justified. Um, and it's been said that the American clergy were the um, single most important factor in the American Revolution in terms of getting ordinary people behind the effort, because most people weren't reading Jefferson and Adams on natural rights and law and so forth. They were reading highly educated clergy coming out of Harvard and Yale um, and so on. That those schools turned out their most common profession that of the graduates was ministry. Um, they're, they were getting the blessing of their pastors. This is much forgotten, um, or was until recently, much forgotten or neglected in literature about the founding. But Protestant Christianity was hugely important, and I emphasize Protestant because Catholics were very much frowned upon, and thought to be um, non-democratic because of the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. So Protestants, sort of, especially in the dissenting tradition, people, protesting against religious tyranny and following their own conscience and so forth. The last main intellectual influence on the founding was what's come to be called radical Whig theory. You had this group of writers um, coming out of the Puritan tradition that brought about the Civil War um, in England. Not necessarily people from that, or not necessarily Puritans either directly, but very much pushing for a more Republican government, a more popular government, um, stressing the need for virtue and the corruption of human beings and the need uh, to restrict the power of government because of that deep distrust of government, and pushing for reforms like more something closer to universal suffrage, greater freedom of the press, um, freedom of religion, and so forth. Um, and you could sort of see it encapsulated by Jefferson in the statement, "That government that governs best governs least." Uh, he got that mode of thinking partly from radical Whig theory. Um, so, what about the philosophical political legacy of the American founding? Well, first of all, there's natural rights theory. You see in the Declaration. Um, you also get during the Revolutionary period the birth of the abolition movement, as people are championing the rights of man and so forth. It becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the conflict between those principles and the owning of slaves. And so people like Jefferson began to, move toward in that direction, right? At least adopting the idea of gradual abolition of slavery. Um, the Bill of Rights, uh, certainly, they thought the purpose of a constitution, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, is to secure those inalienable rights, those God-given inalienable rights that are mentioned in the Declaration. And in a modern context, you can see this with Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where he appeals to um, higher law and he appeals to the Declaration of Independence explicitly. And he does the same in his I Have a Dream speech. Um, a second legacy, in addition to natural rights theory, is constitutionalism. Um, having a written constitution meant to um, limit the discretion of people in power. Bills of Rights, which you had one in Britain, but it was the American version that really became famous worldwide. And then checks and balances, divisions of government, and elaborate checks and balances to prevent tyranny. And finally, in relation to religion and politics, the American solution to the religion political problem, with the institutional separation of church and state, as Locke suggested. But unlike Locke, maintaining a public role for religion, and you see this in Martin Luther King. I mean, he appeals in that letter to Augustine and Aquinas, as well as to Socrates and others. He was a Baptist minister. He was a Baptist minister pushing for political reform. This is a very public role for religion, and until relatively recently, that was kind of a normal um, element in American politics. Um, I think I better have a separate lecture on the French. It's going to be much shorter, but let's stop there on the American founding, and we'll take up the French separately. See you later.